In this video, I want to get a little deeper into histograms. You might already be done with histograms and not want to know anything more about them, but histograms are your lifeline to perfect exposure and to perfect development when you get into your software. The histogram, as we mentioned before, is a graphical representation of the tonal range of your image as it was exposed in your camera. And it's based on some calibrations that are true of all cameras. So the good thing about this right now, it might seem like exposure is just getting more and more and more complicated, and your head is hurting and you want to go back to the simple time when you were just using your iPhone. But actually we're getting closer and closer and closer to simplifying exposure and helping you to be much more confident with the exposures that you're making, and that the exposures that you make are going to get you the end result that you want. It also, believe it or not, is going to get you to a point where you go out to a scene such as this, when I was photographing this old house near Fairfield, and I could meter once. I could just check my histogram and then feel very confident that the next 10 or 15 or 20 photos that I made were going to be exposed exactly right. Yes, that's right. I didn't have to check my meter with every single frame, as you're probably doing right now, because I was able to make an educated judgment about the kind of light that was in the scene and the way that it was going to expose my image, and I could just use the same exposure until I wanted to change the look of the image in terms of shutter speed or depth of field. Okay, well, let's get started. I just pulled this photo up so that you could take a look at the histogram in Lightroom. I know that the last video was in a different program called Adobe Camera Raw. It is almost identical to Lightroom. Don't worry about how it's related right now, but just know that when we're looking at things in Lightroom, it's really exactly the same thing in the video that you just watched. Now, this is a typical histogram. This is an RGB histogram, which means that it's representing the red, the blue, and the green of the colors in this, and when they cross over, the yellows, the magentas, and the cyans. These are parts of the color wheel that we're going to get into later in the semester. But basically, overall, it's giving us a generalized view of the highlights and the shadows and the midtones and the whites and the blacks of our image, all the way from here to here. So there are no bad histograms. There might be histograms that you're not going to be happy with for what you're trying to do with your photo, but a histogram is basically objective. It's just showing you what the tonal range is like in your exposed image. Okay, I want to go on and I'm going to show you some really strange and somewhat boring but very, very useful examples of exposure and of histograms. Okay, so we're just going to go to this image. Okay, I will tell you what this is of. I took this in my studio, and it is a photograph of a black fake fur coat and a pile of doll underwear. Okay, don't ask me why I have a pile of doll underwear in my studio. It just happened to be the right subject for this demonstration. I needed something that was white but had a lot of texture and detail, and something that was dark but had a lot of texture and detail. And these things really supplied that. I set them up so that they were exactly half and half in my frame, this diagonal line going through. Well, exactly, I would say very, very close. I tried to approximate it so that the very, very bright area was taking up half of the frame and the very dark area was taking up half of the frame. Now, unlike the image that I just showed you, these images come directly out of my camera. I have not processed them in any way. You can see that all of the sliders are set to their original settings as it came out of the camera. I made this exposure, I metered it, and I did exactly what my meter told me to do as I looked through the camera. And so it told me with my ISO at 400, my 60mm lens, that I should be at f4 at 125th of a second. And so I made the photograph, and by golly, if it doesn't look pretty good. Now, I'm going to make some adjustments so you can understand why histograms give us a great starting exposure that can be developed. But don't worry about that yet. I want you to notice the difference in the shape of this histogram generally from the previous one. A histogram, remember, it represents the tonalities of your image. And this photograph is of bright white underwear and a dark black fur coat. And so this is the representation down here. This clump or peak of tonal range is this area here. And this represents all of these light areas over here. Okay, there's nothing in the middle pretty much because there really isn't very much that's just middle gray or in the middle of the image. Now I also chose a black image and a white image, or a black object and a white object, because it's a lot easier to analyze tonality to start with when you're just looking at blacks and whites. Colors also have a tonal range. They show up as middle or high or low, and your camera doesn't care. Your exposure meter, I should say, doesn't care about color. It only cares about black and white. So that's why I started with these. Now, I want you to be patient with me, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the exposure by a full stop and see what happens to the histogram. So I go from 1/25th of a second to a 250th of a second to a 500th of a second. I got those out of order. And then down to 1,000th of a second. Okay, did you notice what happened to the histogram? Let's try that again. So here the histogram looks perfectly split. Here it's moving over, and you can see, although the highlights actually look better, they're sort of moving over towards the gray area. And this is still on the edge, but it's moving over to the left as well. We go here and it moves even further. And so now the doll underwear, which should be a bright white predominantly, is more looking like it's in the gray area. And the fur coat is really pushed up onto the edge. Now we're getting that little blue flash, which I'll talk to you about in the next image. So now we're going to go all the way to 1,000th of a second. And you notice now that everything is pushed to the left. There's no highlight area at all. This actually represents middle gray. And so you can see that right now the doll underwear does look kind of grayish. And if we go here, we'll see that this area, this is the fur coat, is actually getting very, very dark. And we're losing the detail. What this means, this is called clipping, and this means that there are no details left in the areas where the blue shows up. You're going to see this in the other direction when we go to the next one. Okay, so that's what's happening to the histogram as we underexpose. It's starting to make the doll underwear look sort of more textural and maybe okay, but we're going to start to lose detail in the shadows. Let's go to the other direction. This is back to 1/25th of a second. Let's go to a 60th of a second. And notice how very quickly this is nice and bright and textured, but this moves over, and immediately, and this is more dangerous than the other direction, we start to get some clipping on the doll underwear. We go again. I'll pull this away. And we have more clipping yet. And we go here and it's really completely clipped. And what I mean by clipped is that this has gotten so overexposed that the details, the possibilities for details, are cut off. Okay, let me just show you what I mean by that. Let me come back to this image, which is our we'll come back to this one, which is our 125th. Now, even though this looks a little bit bright, as we pull this down, watch what happens. See how all that texture and detail comes back? That's because the information is there. If we go to this one, the one that was terribly clipped, we might say, well, we can just bring the exposure down. Look what happens. Nothing comes back. It just turns into this gray mush. Okay, so this is giving you hopefully a little idea about why this correct exposure, or this ideal histogram, or I shouldn't say ideal histogram because there are no bad ones, but the histogram that is representing your highlights and details is within this range. You want it to be so that your whites are bright and they're up here, your darks are deep and they're down here. Okay, now I want to go on to this picture. So what I did is I took the fur coat out and I just put out the doll underwear. And I metered it again so that everything that was in the frame was just this doll underwear. And it told me that I should be doing this f4 at 1,000th of a second. Interestingly, that was that darkest exposure. Okay, so what happened? Well, it doesn't look terrible, but it does look kind of dingy and gray. And this underwear really should be bright white. This is what my meter told me to do. Now, this is where you begin to understand how meters work, because the meter is trying to make everything gray. The meter is trying to average everything together, which you can see for this image worked quite nicely. But for something that's all white, it's kind of not so great. Everything is clumped into the middle. And I'm going to give you an exercise to do this week where you actually just go around, both with your DSLR, but with any camera, and just photograph some pure white, pure black, pure gray surfaces and see what happens. Okay, let's watch what happens as we start to add the exposure back. That looks much nicer, and you can see now that is over into the highlight area. We have midtones and highlights. This would be not a bad exposure. When we get up here, it actually is quite lovely and bright, beautiful texture and detail, but a very nice bright. It's over in what we call the highlight area. If we go one more, now this is deceptive because it looks like, wow, it's really overexposed. But here's what I want you to pay attention to about histograms. It's so very cool. See this little space right here? That means that even though this histogram is pushed all the way over to the right, it is not clipped. Okay, watch what happens. If I grab my exposure and I bring it down, all of the texture and detail is there. This is related to a concept we call exposed to the right. And that is, the ideal with a raw photo is that you expose so that the image, the histogram pushes over to the right, but doesn't cross over, because that gives you as much information as possible to make your final image. Okay, well, let's see what happens with the fake fur coat. So I moved the doll underwear over, I put the fake fur coat down, and I did what my meter told me to do. And in this case, my meter says I should do it at f4 at 1/10 of a second. Really long exposure. Good thing I had it on a tripod. And you can see that even though it's not just sitting right in the middle, overall, it's big and clumpy and mostly in the center. It's trying to make it that middle gray. It's trying to even all that out. So let's try the same thing. Let's actually start to drop the exposure by one stop. And you can see that's much better. It's pushing over to the left. This is at 1/20th of a second, so I cut the exposure in half. And then we're going to go one more. And again, notice that if I have this little space, it is not overexposed, or it's not underexposed, excuse me. And if you look in, you can see that we have wonderful texture and detail all over the place. Let's go one more. And you can see we're still not clipped. This is really lovely, and I'm going to show you the opposite thing. When we zoom in, since it is the exposure is much lower, and this by the way happens to be, it's an 80th. We're not quite to 1/125th, which is ideal. But what we can do is, if we bring the exposure up, we can begin to see all the texture and the detail again because it's there. Okay, so this is actually overexposed. We don't have room to bring that down. These are acceptable, but this is actually a really nice exposure for a deep shadow. You see it's rich and dark and textural, but it has plenty of detail. So I'm going to show you a series of photos, beginning with this one. This is the doll underwear again. These are all objects that I metered with my camera, and I did exactly what the meter told me to do. Then I went ahead and I converted them to grayscale. I converted them to black and white because I want you to see them without the colors compared apples to apples, so to speak, although the apples will not be red. So I metered the doll underwear, and I did exactly what the meter told me to do. And let's take a look at the histogram. And this is exactly what meters try to do. My meter's working great because it actually made the very, very much middle gray. We have this big clump of tonality right in the middle. So this was f4 at an 800th of a second. And it doesn't look bright white the way the underwear does, but it does look like a perfect middle gray. So this is what your camera is trying to do. I call it the middle gray touch. Your camera is calibrated for middle gray. Anything that it touches, it will make middle gray. Remember that this works pretty well for most scenes because most scenes aren't all white or all black. But you can see that it can get you into some trouble when they are. This is the fur again. I just metered it, and it is f4 at 1/10 of a second. So very long exposure. And this is some plastic on top of a computer, I believe. And so this said f3 at 1/2000th of a second. Forgive me, I changed my aperture, but I still did what my meter told me to do. Then I went outside and I metered this dark corner underneath my porch. It metered f4 at 1/15th of a second. This blackboard metered f4 at a 1/4 of a second, very slow. And you can tell that I did hand hold that, so it is quite shaky. And then I photographed this white plastic bag. Yes, that should be white. And it metered f4 at a 500th of a second. Now, what I want to show you is that all of these, this is one more, this is actually something that is gray. And notice that it metered very close to 125th of a second because it's actually gray. And I did what it told me there. Okay, let's go back. What I want to do is actually pull all of these up, these grayscale images. And I want to put them into survey mode because I want you to see how very similar they are, to see what your camera is doing. Your camera works really, really hard to make everything generally middle gray. And as I mentioned again, works fine if you have an equal amount of light areas, dark areas, and midtone areas, or if your subject is midtone. But it's not so great when you have a very dark object that doesn't reflect a lot of light or a very bright object that reflects a lot of light. It tends to clump everything together. Okay, let's take a look at how these objects, some of these objects should have been exposed. So here's the plastic wrap. We'll go back over here. So you can see that if I want to move that over so that it looks as bright white and textured as it was in real life, I need to bump this over, get this over, get the histogram to move over, and that means taking it up by about 2 stops. And this is almost always true. Actually, I guess it's about 2 stops, 2.5. So let's take a look at this scene. This is how I photographed it metered. We've got the colors back in it so you can see. Now keep in mind that this is this very dark shadowed corner that I wanted to look kind of creepy. And this is making it look almost as if there's sun shining on it. So in order to expose it correctly, I actually dropped the exposure down, and you can watch the histogram move over to the left. I dropped it by 2 stops, and we have this nice dark creepy corner. Last one is this blackboard, and blackboard should be nice rich black with the bright white writing. So I dropped that down about 1.5 stops. Okay, so these are very typical scenes where you might have to raise or lower the exposure in order to get it correctly. We'll look one more time at the doll underwear, the famous doll underwear. So the most egregious error that you're going to make with exposure is actually not overexposing with your dark areas. It's going to be underexposing your bright areas. We want to get enough exposure to make sure that we get detail and texture. So remember, this is how the underwear exposed. In order to get the correct exposure, I needed to go up at least 2 stops. This is actually quite good. This is about where I'd go. 3 stops will make it super bright, acceptable, but doesn't look right on the screen, but still remember that it puts it within range. so that it's not clipped and we can actually bring it back down. Okay, so the last thing I want to do in this presentation is just to go over and show you different famous photographs and take a look at the histograms so you can think about how the photographer made the photographs, how they thought about their exposure, and how these histograms represent the final image. So this is a night scene by Todd Hito, and notice again there's no bad histograms except a histogram that doesn't give you what you want, and this histogram appropriately is giving us mostly shadows, midtones, shadows, and very, very deep areas with a tiny bit of brightness. That represents that window. Here's another one. This is a photograph by Edward Bertinsky. And notice how we have this wonderful, beautiful, big clump of deep areas where the lava is. A little bit of spike of red where the lava is. This is a spike towards the highlight area. Still not bright, 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 and just the tiniest bit of the very bright areas. This is by Uta Barth, and you can see that, of course, this is kind of like the doll underwear. Most of the histogram is up high. This is by Richard Misrock, a beautiful landscape of water and clouds. And yes, it needs to be up here. The important thing is that it's not clipped all the way over here. It's still got beautiful tonality and color. This looks very much like my doll underwear with the fake fur coat. This is by Camille Seaman, and it has this beautiful dark sky and the bright white bergs. So we have this split histogram. And you can see that a photograph that is really, truly, the scene needs to be middle gray, will appropriately have a histogram that is middle gray. There's nothing wrong with a histogram where everything is in the center like this, as long as it is true to the photo that you are trying to represent. Okay, I hope that gives you some clue about histograms and doesn't turn you off completely. There'll be an exercise for you to play with your camera, just seeing what histograms do. And we will come back to this and we'll get into more detail about exposure later in the term.